Welcome to my world history notes, where I'm going to read from the book I wrote to teach world history to homeschoolers, entitled A Bible Believer Looks at World History. You can find it on lulu.com, amazon.com, or at the Bible Baptist Bookstore. Just follow me here. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about life in first century Rome, and Rome in general. Then we're going to go on to China, Africa, Europe, and the Americas after we get through with a few sessions discussion about Rome. So the classic work on Roman agriculture is the De Re Rustica. Remember the word rustic for something quaintly rural, of 65 AD, written by Junius Columella. He was a retired farmer who came from Spain. He tells us that the best lands were taken up by the villas of the rich, the next by olive orchards and vineyards, and finally the worst was left to the farmer. The lowest were slaves resorted to such farming, he laments, while the freemen were fleeing to better opportunities in the cities. He loved the soil and felt that it was a crime for men to abandon honest farming for what they would find in a city. I agree with him. In his writing, he tried to persuade people to return to the soil like good Romans should, in his estimation. It was during this period also that Pliny the naturalist wrote that large farms had ruined Italy. Similar statements were made by such writers as Juvenal, Seneca, Lucan, Petronius, and Martial. Seneca complains about cattle ranches bigger than some kingdoms, like America would have had out west in the 19th century. Columella said that the masters of these ranchers could not even ride around them to see how big they were. Pliny refers to one estate consisting of over 4,000 slaves and nearly 300,000 animals. Land distributions by Gracchi, Caesar, and Augustus had increased the number of small farms. These are redistributions. But most of these have been abandoned during the many wars and bought up by the rich. At the beginning of the first century, it was realized that there were more profits to be made by cattle, oil, and wine than by growing grain and vegetables. But by the end of the century, that was being tested due to the rising cost of slaves. Thus began a long transition from slavery to serfdom, where an eventual peacetime lack of captives for slaves led to the rich landowners breaking up their estates into smaller plots to rent to poor farmers who would have been called sharecroppers in the rural South of America 100 years ago. The tools of farming had not changed in 2,000 years. The plow, excuse me, the plow pulled by oxen, the spade, the hoe, the pick, the pitchfork, scythe, and rake were all still used just as they had been. Grain was ground in mills turned by water or animals. Horses were bred mostly for war or sport and did not usually pull the plow as the oxen had for 2 millennia. Olive orchards were numerous, but vineyards were everywhere. Italy had 50 types of wine, and Rome alone consumed 25 million gallons a year, 2 quarts per week for every man, woman, and child. Needless to say, many types of wine were not fermented and would be considered to be grape juice today. There was no sugar as we know it, but bees were raised to provide honey for sweetening. We'll talk more about alcohol consumption next time. The ancient country home was also a small factory. Men and women produced leather and wooden farm and household implements, clay vessels, and tiles. A family was most successful when it provided all of its own needs and could sell its excess to the outside. Sometimes an artisan would set up a shop in a village and serve many families, but this did not change the independence of the individual family unit. The miller would grind grain for many people, bake the bread, and deliver it. Over 40 bakeries were found in the ruins of Pompeii, the famous victim of Mount Vesuvius's eruption. Everyone wore homespun clothing. Only the wealthy were able to have it cleaned, bleached, and cut in a fullery. Some delicate woolen fabrics were made in factories. Mining was done mostly by slaves, and criminals in the gold and silver mines of Gaul and Spain, the lead and tin mines of Spain and Britain, the copper mines of Cyprus and Portugal, the sulfur of Sicily, the salt beds of Italy, the iron of Elba, and marble in Luna, with most of these enterprises owned by the state. The gold of Spain yielded the Emperor Vespasian, whose son and heir Titus was the ravager of Jerusalem, approximately $80 million per year in revenue in today's money. Tacitus tells us that it was the mineral wealth of Britain that was the prize of his conquest. The art of turning iron into steel had now moved from Egypt to the entire empire. The building trades were organized into tree bearers, cutting and hauling timber, woodworkers making houses and furniture, cement mixers, structores who laid foundations, note the similarity to the word structure, arch builders, framers, plasterers, plumbers, etc., etc. Bricks and tiles were often provided by factories that made such, and later emperors such as Trajan, Hadrian, and Marcus Aurelius made fortunes owning them. Tableware, dishes, and the like were mass produced and often of low quality. Glass, brick, tiles, pottery, and metalware were, were factory produced, although there were only two factories in Rome itself, a paper mill and a dyeing establishment. In the factories of central Italy, the managers and all of the workers were slaves, while in northern Italy there were a greater quantity of free men at work. The existence of slaves discouraged the development of machinery, and as in the antebellum or pre-Civil War southern United States, inhibited the growth of industry in general. Having plentiful slaves lowers the level of ingenuity of the people and leaves a culture stunted in technology. As Booker T. Washington, a former slave himself, noted in his classic Must Read, and I say must read, you should read it. Up from Slavery. The slave culture degrades both master and slave and limits innovation and creativity, keeping a culture in a backward condition, even turning the elite into unimaginative and lazy people. Now, I'm not classifying ancient Greece or Rome as lazy cultures by any means, but merely saying that from Durant and Washington and Tacitus, among others, that one can see that for all the supposed glory of Rome and Greece, a civilization based on enslaving other human beings is a far step from what it could have been. Slavery breeds cruelty, and even the Roman philosophers admitted that all cruelty is a sign of weakness, if I may paraphrase the brilliant Seneca, playwright and philosopher, who, although not a Christian, died during Nero's wicked reign, as did Paul and Peter. Wheeled vehicles were forbidden in the city of Rome during the day. People walked and were carried by slaves on litters or chairs. For long distances, they traveled on horseback or in carriages or chariots. Travel by public stagecoach could get you as much as 60 miles a day. Contrast that with the fact that you can drive that far in an hour or fly that far by airplane in a few minutes. Caesar is said to have traveled by carriage 800 miles in 8 days. Messengers bearing news of Nero's death from Galba in Spain covered 332 miles in 36 hours. And Tiberius, riding day and night, is said to have traveled 600 miles in 3 days to be at his dying brother's bedside. The mail averaged 100 miles a day. Augustus had modeled the postal system on the Persian system, carrying official correspondence at all hours of the day and night by horseback and carriage. Private individuals could only use it by special permission through a government diploma, meaning double folded, a passport entitled the bearer to certain privileges, entitling the bearer to certain privileges. A more rapid means of communication was sometimes arranged by semaphores. That's a visual signaling apparatus with flags, flashing signals from point to point. It was by this method that Rome was notified when grain ships brought needed supplies to Puteoli on the coast. Merchants and private friends would deliver messages also, and there is some evidence that under the empire, private companies transmitted private mail. The speed of mail across Caesar's empire moved faster than it would across Europe until the advent of the railway system in the 1800s. The network of roads that Romans built was essential to communication and transportation then, as they are today. One of the greatest problems that so-called third world countries have is the lack of those vital arteries of commerce and travel that crisscross more modern civilized states. Until modern times, the highway system of Europe was inferior to that of the Romans. Italy had 372 main routes and 12,000 miles of paved roads. The empire itself had 51,000 miles of paved highways and many thousands of miles of secondary roads. Highways even ran over the Alps mountains. One road called the Appian Way can still be seen today. Magnificent bridges replaced ferry boats, and at every mile on the consular roads, a marker gave the distance to the next town. At certain intervals, seats were placed for tired travelers. At every tenth of a mile, a statio, note the modern word station, offered a stopping place where fresh horses could be rented, and at every 30 miles was a mansio, note modern word mansion, an inn that was a store, a saloon, and a brothel. In spite of what this sounds like, it was still dangerous to travel alone. Innkeepers often robbed their customers, robbers and highwaymen were frequent dangers, and in spite of garrisons of soldiers at each statio, the wealthy preferred to sleep in their own carriages, protected by their own slaves. Despite the difficulties and danger, there was more traveling than at any time before the modern era. Seneca spoke of how many people travel great distances to see remote sights, and Plutarch spoke of globetrotters who spent most of their lives at inns or on boats and roads. The educated traveled to Egypt, Greece, and Asia, scratched their names on historic monuments, sought special climates and healing sites for health, enjoyed art collections at distant temples, studied under famous philosopher gurus, and grand tours around the empire were sold by merchants, we would today call travel agents. Ancient Inventions by Peter James and Nick Thorpe, Ballantine Books, 1994, tells us that the roads of Rome were only rivaled by the roads of China, and China's were not nearly as extensive. Shi Huangdi, the great emperor who unified China, had created 9-lane highways, standardized the width of chariots at 5 feet, and made central lanes exclusively for himself, with anyone using it being executed. The Incas of Peru, after 1400 AD, had over 15,000 miles of roads for official and private use. But the Romans were master road builders, as they were creators of massive buildings and temples. Rome had apartment buildings and public baths where patrons could sweat in the tepidarium, note the modern word tepid, and then jump into the cool waters of the frigidarium. There are many things you would recognize in ancient Rome, but it might not take long before you felt at home there. There were many things you recognized in ancient Rome that it might not take long for you to feel at home there. Our modern appliances and power have replaced the dependence on human slaves, but even today we buy clothing and products made by slave prison labor in China or by the forced labor of children in third world countries. If they were born here, we would be going to school rather than working 12 hours a day to provide wealthy countries with everything from expensive athletic shoes to household decorations. Next, we're going to have a discussion about alcohol use in Rome, and then we're going to go on to Roman engineering, religion, and then we'll go on to China. So we have like 3 days. We'll spend 3 more times in Rome before we go on to China. Okay, thank you very much. I enjoyed doing this, and I hope it makes you study world history. And Rome is fascinating, and it's the source of so many of our institutions and social structures that we still use. It's just important that you understand, or you do some digging about Rome, read some books about Rome. Thank you.